burning cars, riot police in the streets, politicians shouting in parliament. This is the United Kingdom in the 2020s, a country that once ruled a quarter of the world now struggling to control its own borders. More than 1 million people arriving every year, illegal crossings at record highs, entire neighborhoods where the state has quietly stepped back. This didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decades of decisions made in the name of tolerance, openness, and moral responsibility. And now, Britain is facing the consequences. This is the story of how the UK lost control, and why it's becoming one of the most divided countries in Europe. After the Second World War, Britain was exhausted. Its cities had been bombed, its economy weakened, and its empire was rapidly dissolving. But unlike much of continental Europe, Britain emerged from the war with something still intact: its global reach. The British Empire was fading, but the Commonwealth remained. And with it came a new idea, that Britain was not just a nation, but the center of a global family tied together by history, language, and shared sacrifice. In 1948, the British Nationality Act granted citizens of Commonwealth countries the right to live and work in the UK. At the time, this wasn't framed as mass immigration. It was framed as continuity. People from the Caribbean, South Asia, and later Africa were invited to help rebuild the country. The Windrush generation became a symbol of this moment. Men and women arrived to work in transport, healthcare, manufacturing, and public services. They filled labor shortages and were largely welcomed. But what began as limited labor-driven migration slowly transformed into something much larger. By the 1960s and 1970s, immigration into the UK was no longer temporary. Families settled, communities formed, and the country faced a question it had never fully prepared for: how to integrate large populations with very different cultural, religious, and social norms. Britain's answer was different from that of France or Germany. France chose assimilation, one public identity, one secular framework, one set of rules. Germany treated migrants primarily as workers, not future citizens. The UK chose something else entirely. It embraced multiculturalism as official policy. Rather than asking newcomers to adapt to a single national culture, Britain encouraged cultural autonomy. Communities were allowed, even encouraged, to preserve their language, customs, and religious practices. The state would manage diversity, not reshape it. This approach was rooted in Britain's liberal tradition. The belief was that tolerance would prevent conflict, and that over time, coexistence would naturally lead to integration. But coexistence is not the same as cohesion. As migration continued through the 1980s and 1990s, Britain's cities began to change in visible ways. London, Birmingham, Manchester, Bradford, and parts of Leeds became deeply diverse, not just in ethnicity, but in social structure. Entire neighborhoods emerged where English was no longer the primary language. Schools became segregated by community. Religious institutions took on roles far beyond worship, acting as social authorities, mediators, and informal power centers. For a long time, this was not seen as a problem. Crime rates were manageable, the economy was growing, and political leaders were reluctant to challenge a model that symbolized Britain's moral progress. Criticism of multiculturalism was often dismissed as reactionary or intolerant. Raising concerns about integration became socially risky. Institutions learned to avoid confrontation. This silence had consequences. By the early 2000s, cracks were becoming harder to ignore. Educational outcomes diverged sharply between communities. In some areas, schools struggled with language barriers and cultural conflicts. Teachers reported pressure from parents over curriculum, gender norms, and authority in the classroom. At the same time, trust in institutions began to erode. Police forces were increasingly cautious in certain neighborhoods, prioritizing community relations over enforcement. Social services adapted to cultural expectations rather than enforcing universal standards. The state was still present, but unevenly, and then came the scandals that exposed the cost of avoidance. In towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford, investigations revealed the systematic sexual exploitation of vulnerable girls by organized grooming gangs, many operating for years without intervention. What shocked the public wasn't just the crimes themselves. It was the institutional failure. Police, social workers, and local officials had repeatedly failed to act, not because they lacked information, but because they feared accusations of racism or cultural insensitivity. Victims were ignored, whistleblowers were silenced. The priority was avoiding controversy. This moment shattered a long-standing illusion that tolerance alone could manage deep cultural conflict. For many citizens, it was the first time they openly questioned whether the system was still working. At the same time, migration into the UK accelerated. Following EU expansion in the 2000s, millions of people from Eastern Europe moved to Britain. Later, asylum applications increased from conflict zones in the Middle East and Africa. Net migration reached record levels year after year. By the 2000s, the UK was experiencing demographic change at a pace few countries had seen before. In London, native British residents became a minority. In some boroughs, over half the population was foreign-born. This diversity was celebrated in official discourse, but the lived experience was more complex. Wages stagnated in low-skilled sectors, housing shortages intensified, public services came under strain, and the sense of a shared national identity weakened. People didn't necessarily oppose immigration in principle, but they felt that no one was in control of the process. This growing disconnect between political messaging and everyday reality fueled resentment, not just toward migrants, but toward institutions themselves. Trust collapsed. When the Brexit referendum arrived in 2016, it became a release valve for years of accumulated frustration. While the vote was framed as a decision about the European Union, at its core it was also a revolt against unmanaged change. Immigration was not the only issue, but it was central. The result shocked the political class, but for many voters it felt inevitable. The UK now finds itself in a paradox. It built one of the most open, tolerant societies in the world, but in doing so, it avoided hard questions about limits, expectations, and enforcement. Multiculturalism created space for difference, but not always for unity. Today, Britain is no longer debating whether diversity exists. That debate is over. The real question is whether a country can function without a shared framework, without common norms that apply equally to everyone, and that question is becoming harder to avoid. What the Brexit vote revealed wasn't just opposition to European bureaucracy. It revealed a deeper anxiety about control, over borders, over law, and over the meaning of citizenship itself. For years, the UK had combined two forces that rarely coexist comfortably: mass migration and weak integration policy. On paper, the country was diverse and open. In practice, it was increasingly fragmented. Unlike countries that enforced assimilation or clear civic requirements, Britain relied on an assumption that tolerance would eventually produce cohesion, that if communities were left alone long enough, they would organically blend into a shared national identity. But identity doesn't form in a vacuum. It requires institutions to set boundaries and expectations. And Britain largely refused to do that. One of the clearest examples of this failure can be seen in education. Public schools became the front line of cultural negotiation. Teachers were asked to manage classrooms where students came from radically different backgrounds, not just linguistically, but in terms of values, gender norms, and authority. In some areas, schools adapted by lowering expectations. Sensitive topics were avoided. Parents exerted pressure over curriculum content. School administrations prioritized community harmony over uniform standards. The result was not inclusion, but separation. Children grew up in parallel environments, physically close, but socially distant. Friend groups formed along cultural lines. English proficiency varied dramatically. Civic education lost coherence. Instead of being a shared space where a common identity was formed, schools became mirrors of fragmentation. This fragmentation extended beyond education. In many urban areas, religious and cultural institutions took on roles traditionally held by the state. Mosques, community councils, and informal leaders became mediators between residents and authorities. In principle, community engagement is positive. In practice, it often meant that the state outsourced authority. Police forces relied on community leaders to maintain calm. Local councils negotiated exceptions rather than enforcing rules. Laws were applied unevenly, depending on context. This approach was meant to reduce conflict. Instead, it created ambiguity. When laws are negotiable, legitimacy suffers. At the same time, the economic picture became more complicated. While immigration contributed to growth in certain sectors, it also intensified competition at the lower end of the labor market. Wages stagnated, Housing demand surged. Infrastructure struggled to keep up. These pressures disproportionately affected working-class communities, many of whom had little political voice. When concerns were raised, they were often dismissed as cultural anxiety or misinformation. But for those experiencing overcrowded schools, strained healthcare, and rising rents, the issue was tangible. This dismissal deepened distrust. People didn't feel heard. And when people stop believing that institutions represent them, they begin looking elsewhere. After Brexit, successive governments promised to take back control, but control proved harder to regain than slogans suggested. Net migration continued to rise. New visa categories replaced old ones. Asylum backlogs grew. Illegal crossings increased. Enforcement remained inconsistent. Public confidence eroded further. Perception took hold that the political system was either unwilling or unable to act decisively. Immigration became a symbol of institutional weakness, a visible reminder of promises unmet. This environment created fertile ground for polarization. The debate around migration in the UK increasingly split into two camps. One side defended diversity as an unquestionable good, warning that any restriction would damage Britain's global image and moral standing. The other side demanded firm controls, arguing that without limits, social cohesion would continue to erode. Between them, a large segment of the population felt trapped, uncomfortable with extremes, but dissatisfied with inaction. This middle ground is where legitimacy is lost. What makes the UK's situation particularly difficult is its historical narrative. As a former empire, Britain carries a legacy of global responsibility. Migration is often framed as repayment for colonialism, or as a moral obligation tied to history. But this narrative clashes with modern realities. The people arriving today are not coming from former colonies alone. Migration flows are global, driven by conflict, economics, and opportunity. Historical guilt offers no practical framework for integration, capacity planning, or enforcement. Yet the reluctance to confront this gap remains. Meanwhile, social trust continues to decline. Trust between communities, trust in institutions. Trust that the rules apply equally. This erosion is subtle but cumulative. It shows up in voter behavior, public discourse, and everyday interactions. When people believe that the system is no longer fair or predictable, they disengage or radicalize. Neither outcome strengthens democracy. The UK now stands at a crossroads. It can continue managing diversity through avoidance and symbolic gestures, or it can redefine integration as a two-way process, offering rights but demanding participation, granting protection but enforcing norms. This choice will determine whether Britain remains a shared political community or becomes a collection of parallel ones. The question facing the UK today is not whether multiculturalism was well-intentioned. It clearly was. The question is whether good intentions are enough to hold a society together when change is rapid and expectations are unclear, and whether a country can remain tolerant without first deciding what it expects everyone to tolerate and what it cannot. The United Kingdom's experience shows something deeper than a policy failure. It shows what happens when a society expands openness faster than it defines cohesion. For decades, Britain believed that diversity was self-regulating, that if the state stepped back, communities would step forward, that tolerance itself would create unity. But unity doesn't emerge by default. It has to be maintained. When expectations are unclear, when laws feel flexible, and when cultural norms appear negotiable, people stop trusting the system, not suddenly, but steadily. This is the quiet danger Britain now faces. The UK is not collapsing. Its institutions still function. Its democracy still stands. But something more fragile has weakened, the sense of a shared we. A society can survive disagreement. It cannot survive permanent ambiguity. When citizens no longer agree on basic norms, on the role of law, the limits of culture, or the authority of the state, everyday cooperation becomes harder. Trust erodes, politics becomes reactive, and every crisis feels existential. This is why migration dominates British politics far beyond its statistical weight. It has become the symbol of something larger, the fear that no one is in charge. Importantly, this story is not about migrants as individuals. Millions of people came to the UK seeking stability, safety, and opportunity. Many work, contribute, and integrate successfully. The issue is systemic. Britain built a model that welcomed difference, but hesitated to define belonging. It offered rights generously, but avoided enforcing common standards. It prioritized harmony in the short term at the cost of cohesion in the long term. That trade-off is now coming due. The challenge Britain faces is the same one confronting much of Europe. How do you remain open without dissolving the framework that makes openness possible? How do you protect minority rights without undermining shared rules? How do you integrate people into a society that struggles to define itself? There are no easy answers, but avoiding the questions is no longer an option. The UK's future will not be decided by slogans, referendums, or single elections. It will be decided by whether the country can rebuild clarity about borders, about law, and about civic expectations. Because diversity without structure does not lead to freedom, it leads to fragmentation. Intolerance without limits does not create unity. It creates silence, until silence breaks. If you want to understand how migration, identity, and power are reshaping countries across Europe and beyond, make sure to watch the next video, because this story isn't over, and what comes next will matter even more.